So thank you everyone for joining us. This is session 3. You are in room 5, and you are going to be hearing all about teaching multi-literacies using Flipgrid and Adobe Spark for student discourse. And we have as your presenters today, Adriana Guizar-Vasquez and Claudia Chang-Lopez, and I will let them take it away. Thank you.
Welcome. So as you join in, I'm already seeing some of you sharing your district name and subject or role. Happy to see people joining in. I'm from CCSD and Carson City. We'll get started right about now. Right. So in the chat, I'm going to share one of our resources folder before we begin, so that at any time you want to reference one of those resources ahead, you are able to do so. 1 second. Bit.ly here. And also find our resources, but I'm going to share the link with everyone. So for our agenda, we're going to first take a look at some literacy practices very popular in our classrooms already, and we're going to see how we can implement these with Flipgrid. Next, we're going to look at Photovoice Project-Based Learning with Adobe, which our co-presenter Claudia Chang-Lopez is going to also talk more about. As our third item, we will look at different tech tools and or project brainstorm in breakout spaces. And we'll end with some questions from everyone. So my name is Adriana, and I am an ELA teacher at a career and technical magnet high school. I'm seeing some of you also from SECTA. I teach at East Career and Technical Academy here in CCSD. I started my national board certification journey last year, and this is sort of what inspired me to start looking for more resources for multi-literacies approach and theory. The two pieces of technology that we're going to look at today, Flipgrid and Adobe Spark. I've been working on certificates throughout the past year to really hone my skills in both of those. Today's session, again, will combine sort of the route in my classroom, which is PBL and multi-literacy for ELA. I am currently a content and curriculum ambassador for the Nevada Digital Learning Collaborative, and I'm working with the Nevada Museum of Art as a content and curriculum cohort educator. I'll pass it over to Claudia.
Hi, everyone. So I am a PhD student in curriculum and instruction, focusing on cultural studies mainly. But I also am an instructor in interdisciplinary studies, which is partly where I've explored photo voices in my own classroom. I'm also an Institute of Teachers of Color fellow, and I think those are the important things. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll start with talking a little bit about multi-literacies and technology. So part of this approach is something that we hear about all of the time, and so I'm just pulling some of the research for us to really ground ourselves in what these practices look like now with the use of technology and the shift towards hybrid instruction. And really the main goal of this multi-literacy approach is, again, using our students' skills in spatial, audio, and visual patterns of meaning, really incorporating both their visual literacy skills and incorporating those into the other forms of literacy that we want them to continue improving in, whether that is technology and our instruction aligned to Common Core and the other skills that we build in our classrooms. Part of the shift in this approach is really shifting from seeing only print as our primary carrier of information in our culture and incorporating some of the visual and audio patterns of meaning that our students are possibly working with in their day-to-day, whether that is social media and or in their communities. So for our first one, and this is where I want to hear from all of you prior to jumping into how we can incorporate it with Flipgrid, but do you use Reader's Theater in your classroom? And if so, how do you implement it in your classroom? And if you can just drop your answers in the chat, we'll share in this way for our. I'm seeing Sandy and Nancy saying, nope. Jonathan, have not used it. Laura, Dana. And Sean have used, so you're familiar with Flipgrid and face-to-face, and you've used it in both. So you have used it when you were in the classroom prior to your current role. Okay, so based on this, then I can see that we have different levels of familiarity with this strategy. So I incorporated this initially in my classroom when using a Pearson curriculum for high school. One of the instructional activities that was in there pushed for this idea. And more recently, while attending a Clark County School District training session for struggling adolescent readers, they mentioned the benefits of it, especially for elementary classrooms. And that is where most of the research lies. So part of Reader's Theater is that the major benefits, right, are that they allow for students to have that authentic audience. So they're bringing any text, not necessarily just plays, but they're really bringing any text that they might experience some difficulty with at first. They're bringing it to life by acting it out, by interpreting it, and by, again, working with a group or working with partners in order to verbally deliver it. So part of it, part of what the research shows in terms of why it's effective is that, again, it allows for students to work with peers and with each other, really increase their confidence in reading something once they practice it numerous times. What are some of the limitations of Reader's Theater that the research acknowledges is that this is only one part of that literacy approach, and that this only really helps with what we know as prosody. And really, it allows them to really be able to speak some words that are difficult for them at first and recognize them and become fluent in saying them, so that then they can really begin to focus more so on the comprehension aspect of it. One of the ways that I've incorporated into my classroom, so this was in person, during in-person instruction when I first tried it out. And this was prior to me knowing most of the research behind it and why it's effective. At the time, I incorporated it using, again, some curriculum from Pearson and using Emily Dickinson's poetry as part of it. This was a class with where I had many students who had IEPs. And for many of my students, part of Emily Dickinson's poetry, which is usually very accessible, many of the words in there were not. And so starting out, they had trouble with, for example, being able to pronounce some of the words that are highlighted on the screen. They also had trouble with really seeing the sequence of how these events were happening in the poem. And throughout the process, what I started observing was that in the act of being able to, say, pronounce it with other peers, hearing other peers pronouncing it, practicing how they would say it for this video, and also knowing that in that video, they were going to have to upload it to a platform like Flipgrid, where their peers would eventually have to see their video as well. They were very focused in making sure that they were getting these words right. And not only getting the words right at first, but in the process of acting them out, then they were then incorporating movement. In the top photograph, students are acting out the poem on the left, in which, again, there's an emperor kneeling, and the other actor in the poem is unmoved by all of the acts of honoring her in that process. The bottom one is from a poem from Emily Dickinson as well, Nobody, Who Are You? And students began to, again, interpret this to act out that interaction in which two people are meeting, and those two people are technically one in the poem, but here they're acting this out and understanding what is happening in the poem after initially struggling with the pronunciation of some words and really being able to see the sequence. In our next one, so for Socratic Seminar, again, I think this is a practice that I hear often in secondary schools, and so I'm curious to see if many of you have incorporated it before, or if this is also, this might be a newer practice, especially for other subject areas as well, outside of ELA. So in the chat, if you can let me know if you have used it before. And Sean loves this protocol, and I'm seeing that you're thinking about all the ways that it can be used. Yeah, so we're going to look at a few different ways. Yeah, and the really interesting thing, and we'll look at a little bit too at the research, but can be used across many subject areas and across many grade levels when adjusted. So we're going to look at a little bit of that research. Part of the method I'm going to show you is something I adapted for virtual learning. And so in doing that, I really wanted to think about what are those elements of Socratic Seminar that, although cannot be replicated in the virtual space, can still be maintained. And what I ended up finding also in the research is that, for example, when looking at Socratic seminars in math instruction research, the same elements apply across subject areas, and teachers value some of the same things. The idea of being able to moderate a conversation for students, guiding them, correcting them as they think about it, leading and arguing, but doing so alongside of students. Almost, again, in that Socratic method, I saw someone in the chat mention being a philosophy major, right? And the way that in its original form, right, that it was that peer dialogue and discourse. So some of that, again, continues to appear as part of what's effective about this method in research across different subject areas. The other thing that the research mentioned was, again, this idea that when students are discussing with each other, they're able to revise, refine, and improve their ideas, whether that is math or science or ELA or any subject or content. In the next one, what I found was this research study from a science teacher who looked at questions that would be used for their Socratic Seminar. And it was the same types of questions that I asked my students. Again, this one pertaining specifically to science. And so at the basic level of Socratic Seminar, students are building questions, and we'll look at some examples of what this looks like using Flipgrid. But at the basic level, students are asking those what questions at the bottom of, say, Bloom's taxonomy as well, where they're mostly asking, what does the data show? At the higher level, they're starting to think about what does the data mean? And it can have that social aspect as well, of thinking about society as a whole and really thinking about the social implications of it. What does this data mean when related to real societal issues? And at the final stages of a Socratic Seminar, students are asking those evaluative questions where they're thinking about how this applies to the real world, how does this apply to other knowledge that they bring, and how does this apply to other experiences. So one of the things that I modified in Socratic Seminar from what I had typically done in my classroom in previous years in person was, so I continued some of the practices I found effective before. So I used that avid questioning strategies that I had learned from colleagues over the years. I was using sentence frames and sentence starters, which have always been, I've always found helpful when using these with ELL students in particular, but really with all students. And there's a few things that I think using Flipgrid really changed for me and it allowed me to do beyond what I was doing in the physical classroom. One of those being that I now had a very clear record of students reading. I could hear students reading. I could see students pointing to textual evidence. I could hear students' interactions, how they responded, how they questioned their peers, how they probed each other. And I had much more data on that than I did when doing a Socratic seminar in a single class period. I also think that for many students who might feel shy on a single sitting, it allowed them to still have that authentic audience, because again, students are thinking about this is being recorded, my peers will see it sooner or later. But it allowed for all students to really participate and it not being a single sitting pressure situation. Another thing that Flipgrid allowed is that it allowed me to record and to really be able to group students in more meaningful ways, so that I'm pairing students based on how much of the reading they have completed at a given time, some of their skills in being able to identify evidence versus identify themes, etc. And in the following examples, I'll give you a clear visual of what this looks like and sounds like in the classroom. So at those lower level of questions, and those what questions, right, where they're gathering a general understanding of what's happening, whether that is a data set, whether that is, again, a math concept, or in my case, in my ELA classroom, it was what was happening in this short story that we had just started. This is from a short story called titled Ghost Days, and it's a sci-fi. So students are at first really struggling with even grasping the world building that this author is creating for us, and really grasping the setting. So you'll hear in this recording that students are really trying to make sense of what are these characters even doing? Where are they? How did this happen? But you can see, you'll be able to observe that, again, students are making sense of a complex setting. Students are discussing predictions. They're working through misconceptions by questioning one another. They're comparing as they reread together. So they're even reaching new conclusions as they talk about it. And they're able to find that evidence supported in alignment with our core standards. So I'll play a little bit of this clip in just a moment.
"31, and then the author says this a lot. It's like a repetitive thing, but he says, you must know where you came from. What do you think he means by that?
When I read that, I first took it as like literal, because for me, when I think the beginning of the story, it comes off as futuristic in a way. Like the way they talk about spacesuits and how there are oxygen recyclers. To me, it comes as literally that you must know where you're like the original planet, which is Earth. So it makes me kind of believe that they're not even on Earth anymore, and they're on a different planet.
I kind of thought of it in a similar way. You must know where you came from. I was thinking about like not where they literally came from, but their histories and backgrounds. Because I made a prediction about, it was a really kind of a weird prediction, but I thought the teacher was the one, Miss Coran, she was the one that like created them, or like somehow modified them to live on a poisonous and bad island like that, or planet. So I kind of came up with the prediction, like the adults or like the Miss Coran, they kind of customized them and modified them to become what they are now.
Yeah, it could have been something more genetic like that, maybe.
Could be, yeah.
So for my second question, I put, what is the purpose of the author saying in paragraph 44 that she watched the flutterflies dance through the air? Their 6 translucent bright blue wings beating wildly as they traced out the patterns in the air.
So yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to pause this video because I want to also show you the level 2 questions. And I'm looking at the chat, and we are using Socratic in biology in Canvas. That's exciting. Yes. I was surprised to find so much research across different subject areas for something that I exclusively thought about as an ELA strategy. So that's really exciting. And in this level 2 and 3 questions, so if you notice in the previous example, students were making sense of a recurring phrase throughout this short story. These students are looking at the same parts of the reading, but they're getting at those larger thematic elements. You'll see that they start to look at one metaphor that appears in the passage, and they end this video by connecting it, but they're probing for each other's responses. They clarify, they ask each other what they meant, and they offer alternative interpretations to the same passage. So I'll show a brief clip from this part.
The aliens far more.
And another thing I want to point out as I show this, one of the main things that allows this activity to be successful is that I ask that students cite a paragraph, prepare their question, and then they get the freedom to go out there and record and actually do this. But Flipgrid allows for you to share the screen, share the reading, share those questions. And so I'm able to visually see their thought process as they try to find answers for each other's responses and for each other's questions. So here we go. I'll play a later part of their questioning process.
There's intended purpose for the usage of the word past.
Past and
yes, and it says right there the past of the teachers. Or yeah.
So the word of the past is the history of the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Like in this part of the story, Ona is just fed up with how the teachers were just sticking to the past, stick to their past, and trying to feed it to them, forcing them down their throats that this history is more important than theirs, even though Ona wants to learn more about her history, how she came, where she came from, the inhabitants of the world she's in right now. She doesn't want to learn more about this so-called thing called Earth, and all these things that she probably doesn't even understand. She probably doesn't even think they're real.
Or relevant.
I
think relevant because saying
would be better.
Past is like, oh, it's not relevant now.
No, it's not relevant.
Not relevant to her, but then later on.
Also, in the story also says that these are just tales. She thinks these are tales. She doesn't think these things are real because she's never seen it before. She's never seen the past. She wants to see the past, but she hasn't.
All right. Your next question.
Next question. So for paragraph 21. So the question is, what is your opinion on learning about one's history as it is conveyed in these stories?
One's history. Okay, so it says the past is going to contain this bit by bit through recursion becomes the future. So what is the importance?
Yeah, what is your opinion? Basically what's the importance of one's history?
Importance of one's history. I think it gives you
the importance of learning one's history.
Okay, I think it gives you a great sense of like self. You learn a lot, and you can create your identity off of that. I feel like from your heritage, your ancestors, and you can find like deeper meanings out of everything, and it just gives you further understanding of yourself.
Of yourself, where you came from.
And again, the past becomes the future. The past is always going to be part of you.
Okay, what's your question now? What paragraph?
Paragraph 204.
Okay. And so in this video, what you're seeing is those level 2, level 3 questions in which they're expanding again on this theme of history, but they're connecting it to what they think, right? Their opinions on it. And in a further questioning session, what I am doing with this is that I'm going to play these clips for the class, and students are going to respond to these by using these sort of our model for discussion in a future whole group in-person discussion. So after having discussed it in small partners, we're going to revisit these ideas and also think about whether they've changed as they get deeper into the reading and begin to think about the historical context and other factors. So this sort of becomes students teaching one another through their own close analysis. In this next part, this is where we're jumping into the Photovoice research. And prior to doing that, I'm interested again in hearing what other methods of student discourse might you use, and if you have a specific way in which you choose that discourse method based on the objective for your lesson or your unit. And I'm seeing some amazing sci-fi pairings. This recommendation from Sean. Chalk Talk. Laura, can you tell us a little bit more about that one? I have not heard of this strategy.
Well, probably because we don't have chalkboards anymore. But it's the same thing where they just go up and write on the whiteboard anything they know about a topic. Like if you're going to start a novel in a time period, you just name that time period and they like participate, just write any words. It's just a brainstorming on the board, but they like to get up and move around.
Amazing. Yeah, so it allows for that movement. It allows for students to access that prior knowledge. And it can be recreated in many, I can still picture it in a technology base. I can picture it with our whiteboards. Thank you. And then paper and a plastic protector works. Paper and a plastic protector. I also have not heard about that one. Sean, can you share a little bit more about that one with us?
Yeah, I'm just saying instead of chalk talk, because we don't have chalkboards, we use paper and a plastic protector with a dry erase marker.
Yeah, so the essence of that discourse remains and the tools change over time. Okay, so we're going to look at one format that, so I took this idea from a project-based learning approach, and I was looking through resources from my PBL works, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about those resources in a moment. But what I initially had in mind was that I wanted a project for the beginning of the year in which students could discuss, could collaborate, could talk about something that they had extensive knowledge about already, but that they could put it into right? So they could put it into something that they created and that they could discuss it further and really build an awareness around it to build a narrative. That was my main goal. So in this case, what I ended up using was a Q&A panel discussion. That was how the project started. And I'm going to walk you through how talking to Claudia allowed me to expand this project to some of the research that is out there for how this type of project actually occurs in other classrooms. But what I initially wanted was, I wanted to, again, that core of what I wanted was to build questions, have students prepare and anticipate questions, ask questions, select questions, elaborate on each other's responses, and practice those speaking skills in an impromptu setting. I didn't want them to spend a lot of time planning. We didn't have the time to get into all of the planning skills for outlining and all of that for a public speech, but I wanted them to still present. And so, again, I started with this resource from my PBL works, and this is part of the resources folder. But this website has a large library of many different types of projects that you can do with students. This one was called a community photojournalist project. And so I started with this idea. It also covered ELA, social studies, and art standards. And again, the basis of it was that students would photograph something, build up an essential question, and that then they would come back and share their findings and build a narrative from those photographs. So what I wanted to also learn was what shaped a good learning environment for students, right? And what shaped the learning environment for them. I avoided using things like a good learning environment because I also didn't want to limit students to say that it was a good learning environment for them, although that was primarily what students felt about their experiences. But as part of the objectives, I just set out, again, identifying physical spaces, providing a rationale. So again, being able to support their points, recording a visual and written narrative of spaces that symbolize the core value, and again, being able to discuss collaboratively and develop a shared narrative of those spaces. So I'll also share that template with you, the one over here on the right. later in the session. But again, I started out with writing standards, mostly around research and simply developing the writing clearly. Given that, again, this was a project at the beginning of the year before we had covered any content or skills. What emerged out of this project is that so students went around their school photographing different spaces that they found meaningful. In that final product, what students returned with were some of the things that allow for Photovoice Research to help students make sense of their environment and their world and their communities. So students took photographs of different spaces throughout the school. Over here on the right, these students focused on our tech center and photographed themselves picking out books from the library and from the shelf. So some of the findings and some of my observations as I listened to them talk about these spaces and as I watched them photograph and choose what places to photograph is that they often went for spaces that they found valuable and their peers started to find value in those spaces as they discussed and as they started to choose those spaces and really think about which ones were meaningful to them. They were also able to really reflect on why, right? So why did they feel comfortable in these spaces? What about those spaces allowed them to learn best? And they were able to, again, describe these spaces in relation to them and what they valued about them, whether it was the independence of being in the tech center, the independence of being able to learn from what they wanted to learn, the options, the collaboration. Students built questions for their own pictures so that they would, during the panel discussion, which was the final product, that they would have their peers asking them questions, and they would also be answering some of their own questions that they set out for themselves throughout the process. In this part, these students also, again, the students in this project in particular, they were highlighting some of the things that made their program area meaningful to them. They were able to share that with other students. And again, students were able to see that some of the collaboration that happens in their program area happens across other areas and really find value in other fields and other forms of learning. They were curious about each other. They had a range of narratives about their perception of what shapes community. And for my school in particular, students talked a lot about like leaving a legacy or leaving something for students who come after them. I think part of that is that many of their siblings often also attend the same school. In this student project, students were also noticing things like the fact that their learning environment extends into their buses and the way that for our school being a magnet school where the commute is a bit longer, students often saw those buses as also being a space in which they can socialize and build community. They also showed that they valued collaboration, and so they often photographed classrooms where that happened, and they captured that as part of what made their learning meaningful. In their Q&A discussion, students again were sharing anecdotes of what helped them be successful in classrooms. They probed each other and really wanted to understand. For example, here a student mentioned that playing basketball in PE class allowed him to feel successful and feel more confident across other subject areas, that having that space to really interact with other students allowed him to feel confident, not just in one learning space, but across multiple spaces. And so students asked a lot of questions about why that was. How does self-confidence even help a learning environment? How does this shape anything about learning? So here students are shaping the discourse through the questions that they ask in that final panel discussion Q&A. Now, as a final step in that process, I had students reflect on the skills that they had learned about. I based it in Vygotsky's theory of sociocultural learning. I gave students a scaffolded version, right, in which I'm listing out some of the skills that I anticipated they would learn from this project, and they are checking them off in a survey on Canvas. In those reflection spaces, students talked again about being able to learn from their peers about different ways to learn. They talked about how communication and collaboration for them was essential to the learning process. feeling respected by their peers in a space, that their opinions are valued, was extremely important, and that this project allowed them to see that their peers were respectful of their ideas right off the bat at the beginning of the year. They also chose to take those in question, right? So they also were taking these photographs, and some of students were immediately questioning why they chose those spaces. Some students were not. But this student, for example, noticed that in asking not only her peers in this class, but across different class periods of mine, she was able to see that asking other peers why they had chosen those photographs or asking them about their process not only helped her in better understanding the project, but it helped other students, and it helped the group in double checking that they actually were choosing these in a meaningful way. So throughout this process, and this is where I'm going to pass it down to Claudia, because in my initial version of this project, again, I had just set out to have students photograph spaces and ultimately write a narrative about why and how they photograph these spaces. But in talking to Claudia and telling her about my project, she said, "Oh, you're doing a Photovoice Research," and I thought, yeah, of course that's what I'm doing. But the reality was that I had taken this PBL project idea and kind of turned it into my own thing to meet the needs of what I wanted to accomplish at that time. But Claudia, again, expanded my understanding of what it was that my students were doing and why this was meaningful in many other contexts and for a larger set of research that is out there. So Claudia, I'll pass it on to you to talk to us a little bit about Photovoice and how this research is used in the academic world.
Okay, so I know we want to do small groups and we're kind of running out of time, so I'll just give us like a super quick overview. But Photovoices, generally, when it's used as a research method, you want community involvement, and the focus becomes community change and community investment. So you would go to a group and say, hey, what strengths does your community have that is not being appreciated? Or what change does your community need? And generally you provide people with cameras that can change depending on the community access, right? Who actually has technology to do this. And then once you have collected all the information, all the photographs, you talk to them about what these photographs mean, you would have a community event where you have stakeholders come in. Stakeholders then are told by the people themselves, hey, this is what our community wants. This is what our community appreciates. So for example, in one research project, people are saying, we need green spaces. We need more bus stops. We have water that's leaking out of this one apartment building that nobody is taking care of. Like, what's happening here? And so generally that's the focus with Photovoice Research, the idea of the community is going to be invested and we're going to create some kind of change.
Let me take a look at the time. I do lose track of time. So how much time do we have left for groups to see if we?
It's about 10 minutes.
Okay, so let's just jump into that. All that I was going to show are some of those articles so after Claudia talked to me a little bit about what Photovoices was, I delved into the research and looked at a few different examples of how teachers had used this method across different communities for different purposes, whether it was looking at attendance, looking at what improved attendance, and finding those themes of what created that successful environment. So for our group options, what we wanted to do is that we wanted to give you the option of either staying here in the main room and looking at Adobe Spark and Flipgrid as tools that you can use. And really what I would walk you through is just a very basic overview of the resource library that both of these technology tools offer, and some of their free certificates and PD. And in the breakout space, what we would be doing is more of a brainstorm around creating a PBL, and I will be giving you a template for what I used in my Photovoice project. And you can adapt it to your individual context, and you can brainstorm with Claudia through some potential research questions that you could use with your students. So if you want to stay in the in the main room, again, just tell us in the chat, main room, and we'll look at Adobe Spark and Flipgrid, mostly around the projects. And again, there's more projects you can use this with, but I can walk you through how this can be used for Socratic Seminar, Readers Theater. And if you're interested in option 2, again, tell us in the chat option 2, and you'll be discussing Photovoice Research in more depth. Okay, and I'm mostly seeing the main room, some people on both. So what I'll say is that I am going to share share a template with both all of the links to how to access the Flipgrid PD and also how to access Adobe Spark. And then the only element that would not be in those resources will be Claudia brainstorming with you. So I would say if you want to brainstorm through some ideas for Photovoice, breakout room might be best, and then you can always take a look at those resources after. Okay, and then Claudia recommends staying in this room. Okay, so I'll just run through some of our Flipgrid and Adobe Spark main ways to get set up. If anyone changes their mind at any time, please let us know in the chat and we'll create a breakout space. Okay, so for getting started with Spark and Flipgrid, with Adobe Spark, in the chat, and then again, I asked you about some of the previous strategies, but I have not asked you if you're familiar with Adobe Spark. For those of you in Clark County, we have paid access to Adobe Spark, and we get unlimited features for this tool. So we'll look at a little bit of those. Amazing. All right, so not used. Perfect. Then I'll walk you through how to get started. So with Adobe Spark, the main thing that it can be used for, and again, this can be adapted to many purposes. I use it for those two strategies of Readers Theater and Socratic Seminar. Sorry, I use those for Flipgrid. Adobe Spark, I use it for Photovoice, and it can be used in the same way that Google Slides can be used. And the only thing is that, again, this one has a wider set of tools. So Adobe Spark allows for you to create graphics, whether that's posters, it allows to create web pages, and it allows for you to create short videos. I only showed you still images of my student projects, mostly because I don't have any project that doesn't include student faces in them. And so I couldn't show you those, but it creates a really nice display of student images that allows for transitions. It allows for students to add captions very easily. It's much easier to use, I would say, and to create a nice clean product than Google Slides. The only challenge with Adobe Spark is collaboration, and students felt very frustrated that they couldn't all click on the same video at the same time to create it. But what that allowed them to do actually was that they were able to split some of the tasks, and some students were brainstorming captions while some students were putting the photos in there, and other students were thinking through the questions for the discussion. So it just requires breaking down those roles in group work. But to create an account, and again, I'll share the links to this right now. Let me go ahead and drop these in the chat. So in my folder, very quickly. Okay, so under the tech resources document, and I've shared in that folder, sorry. Okay, so in the Adobe Spark section, this is the link for registering for Adobe Spark. And the main thing to know with this is that if you click over here on the left-hand side, it will take you to a free account of Adobe Spark. But if you're in CCSD, you want to click on the login with school account. And when you do that, it will allow you to, again, continue with Google, and you use your CCSD email that will allow you more features and full access to this platform. So again, it allows you to create posters for different sizes and for many different types of projects. Presentation is the one that, video down here is the one that I used for my student project for Photovoice. And it allows for students to already use some templates that are in existence. It allows for, again, many fonts and options. So to show you here, and it looks like I logged into my personal account because it's offering me to upgrade, but.
And just so you know, we can't see what you're looking at. We just see your file list in Google.
No, okay. I must have shared not full screen, but my own presentation. So let me go ahead and share full screen. Okay, so these are the text resources that are shared in the initial folder. I know we're reaching the end of the session, so I'm going to share this very quickly. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Flipgrid as a final part of this. So, jump back. But in this section, you have the register for an Adobe Spark account, you have the Adobe Educator Exchange, and you have the Adobe Cloud for Education. In the Educator Exchange, there's many different ideas for projects and how you can incorporate a visual as the final product for students. In the Adobe Cloud for Education, you also have professional development and courses that you can go through self-paced. And I want to say, when I did that, CCSD also had some PD credits that you can earn to finish the Adobe professional development that they offer. So at this time, I'm going to share now my next one. Just going to come back to the Flipgrid. This is our final step in this session. And again, PD from Adobe Resources for humanities, social sciences, STEM, and art. They have resources and full lessons and activities and projects for teachers once you get signed up. With Flipgrid, and I would ask you, but we are running short on time, so I'm just going to jump into talking to you a little bit more about how to get started. I know a few of you mentioned already having an account, but again, this one is best in order for projects that require that you record student voices, screen record, or have a video of student faces. In the examples I showed you, they were just screen recording, but there's an option for students to show their faces and have discussions in that way. It's easy to use for recording, uploading, deleting, and it works very similar to social media platforms that students are already very familiar with. Some of the challenges, again, with this one is that they do have a time limit of 10 minutes. And so if, for example, a Socratic Seminar, usually my students take about 15 minutes to complete their 3 questions. They have to submit it in separate sittings. And again, in that resource I just shared with you, you have the registration page, and you have a few other resources for using this with different types of projects. They have a YouTube page where you can watch videos and tutorials for how to use this. And they also have a Flipgrid blog where you can, again, look at ideas for different subject areas, best practices. This is just a list that they offer for different subjects, different pre-K through 8, high school, university. And they offer certificates. Through these certificates, they walk you through the main features, they quiz you at the end, and then they also give you a fun badge to certify you for Flipgrid use. So I'm going to jump to the very end in case you have any questions for us or any ideas for how you plan on implementing these in your classroom. I'll share the resources folder with everyone one more time. And
thank you very much, Adriana and Claudia. That was amazing. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Sorry.